Hello, this video is part of the Triangle Method, a course that I'm currently filming and I'm currently in full swing working on it. So sign up to the mailing list if you want to be notified when it goes public. But let's talk about arrangement. This video is for those of you who sometimes get a little bit stuck in the loop, because let's say that you're an electronic musician, and as electronic musicians often do, they generate their material or they compose things in a loop. And a loop is a wonderful tool to see how all the elements will work together when your song gets very dense. It's a beautiful way to create a musical texture. However, a loop is not a musical story, and music is storytelling, music is movement, music is evolution, music is change. So how do you get from a loop of material to an actual musical story? Well, I want to give you 4 milestones, 4 levels of arrangement complexity that we can explore now together. The very first and simplest and most classic way to arrange your track is doing something called a subtractive arrangement. And in this course, we've seen a lot of subtractive things. We've seen a lot of additive processes and also a lot of subtractive processes. Well, this is again an application of that philosophy. Basically, you make something that's too much and then you chop away from it like a sculptor would sculpt the block of clay until the statue comes out of the block of clay. That's a subtractive process, and you can think of the opposite of a subtractive process as maybe an additive process. And if one is sculpting something out of clay, then an additive process is maybe blowing glass. You start with nothing and then you create something in the exact shape that you're looking for. So for now, we're going to stay in that subtractive processes. We're going to copy our loop across the timeline until the entire timeline is just filled with our loop. And then we're going to chop away at it until a song is left over. Imagine you've got a loop like mine, which is 16 bars. And then to do a simple subtractive arrangement, we're going to call this approach the Lego blocks approach. So what you do is you zoom out of your timeline until you see down here from the very beginning until the very end. We decide how long we want our song to be. Let's say maybe 4 or 5 minutes. And we're just going to select our 16 bars and we're going to do Command Shift D. That's going to duplicate time. That means it's just going to copy everything that happens in those 16 bars. Just going to copy, 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 copy. And at the bottom, we see that we're exceeding 5 minutes. Here, let's do one more. Let's zoom out. This silence at the beginning, maybe let's just delete time. Hop. And so now we've got our chunk of clay that we can subtract from. And so from this point on, my job is to just subtract. And I know I'm going to want a song where not a lot is happening at the beginning and then things get added towards the middle. Then I want to have some moments where the kick goes away and things come back to a certain energy level and then a tail out at the end again for the outro. So maybe you can use the mental model of the energy contour for this. You want the energy to start low and then increase over the course of your set, peak in certain moments, drop back down, and then come back up to the maximum, and then outro at some point. You can also try dragging in a track at the top as a reference track if you want to copy the arrangement of another track. So just make sure that that track aligns to the grid and you can take notes from that track, just copying an arrangement, not the sounds. Let me do a very quick subtractive arrangement of this just by eye. There we go. Something like this could be the track. This very Lego blocks approach, it helps you think in terms of sections, a sections being 8 bars or 16 bars, for example. And as you go from one section into the next, you're always going to hear some elements added to the mix and some elements removed from the mix. If this was to be your final arrangement, a last tip I would give on this is to make sure that at the very beginning you do Command I to insert some silence. And then I would make sure to put the loop brace a little bit before, so there's a tiny bit of silence at the start of your audio. And same at the end, give some space for whatever natural reverb tails to tail off. We're going to undo that for now because we have 3 more levels of arrangement to come. So while this is the best place to begin to learn arrangement, it does also have its limitations. It does feel very loopy. When you go from one section to the next, you hear so many things change that it's easy to visualize this as Lego blocks, as loops just over each other. So the second level of arrangement is where you now start to pay attention to transitions. And what do I mean by transitions? I mean, when you zoom in on the space where one section runs into the next section, you might want to just workshop workshop those moments a little bit to make them a little bit more intentional. The two main concepts I want you to take away here are the turnaround and the marker. The turnaround and the marker. The turnaround is something that signals that we're reaching the end of a section and that some new section is about to begin. So you can imagine the most obvious one would be removing some of the energy in the lows and maybe a kind of a reversed reverb swell or like a noise riser thing that starts to indicate like, oh, here it goes. And then on the transition, you create a marker, which is just a moment that goes psh, a splash of energy. It can be, for example, white noise is a very traditional and typical way to do it, a crash cymbal, but it can be one piece of percussion into a big reverb. It can be whatever you want it to be. This moment can get quite complex. There's a whole bag of tricks that experienced producers might be able to share with you. For example, for the drum groove, we could remove the kick drums. Some people even reverse a section of the drums. I've built in myself already some ear candy that does this. That's my marker that happens there. I know some artists, like for example, Fred again, he'll often do a marker by having a stutter step. Like that. Or do a little false drop where you actually take away the first one as the marker. There's a million different things you can do around the moment of a transition, and it's up to you to start building a little vocabulary of things that you like. And just remember that you can do very explicit transitions, but you also don't have to. You can also be more hypnotic and have less defined edges between your sections. That's also fine. I just want you to have the vocabulary to make this as pronounced as you want it to be for your music. So making turnarounds and making markers. And if you're going to make something from scratch, maybe recycle some of the timbres that are already in your music and just add effects to them, bounce them to audio, reverse them, place them in there. There's a lot of different interesting things you can do in a moment like that. And so you can go in at the edge of each section and explore what you can do at the edge of each section. And they can all be the same, they can all be different. Again, you don't have to overdo this. It's just an area where you could spend more work if you wanted to. At this level of arrangement, you'll probably also want to start going into your moments, like your breaks and your drops, and having a little look to see, is there anything going on there that's worth automating in a little bit more detail? For example, if this is a break and a drop, maybe you want to do a technique like the trilogy break. I explained that in this video from a few years ago. To do a trilogy break here, you would make a moment very sparse, then build up, and then a bit of silence before the actual drop. So transitions and paying attention to unique moments like your climaxes. That's level 2 of arrangement. And what's level 3? Well, I would say that level 3 happens when you add a performance inside of your composition that allows for crescendo and decrescendo. What am I talking about? Those words come from classical music. What are you doing, Oscar? This is supposed to be electronic music. Oh my God, oh my God. In classical music, if you want the music to intensify, you write crescendo. And if you want things to mellow out, you write decrescendo. And that's a good tip for us as electronic music producers, that concept is still relevant to us. So what we want is a musical element that starts mellow and that becomes bigger and more important and more grandiose during the song, and then can also subside and become small again. And that's why a whole part of the triangle method is to perform an element. So you set yourself up with a sound that you can affect the performance of, kind of like in this recording here, where you see at the beginning it starts kind of mellow, and then it grows to something that's probably quite dominant and quite in your face, and then it subsides again later. This performed element is a musical storyline that transcends the boundaries of the individual section, and it glues the entire identity of the track together because it is the protagonist. If everything else in the track is energetic infrastructure, which creates a kind of a theater stage, an empty stage, then this element is the protagonist, the character that walks onto the stage, that lives an interesting story, and that at the end leaves us transformed for having participated. So your simple subtractive arrangement becomes so much more rich and so much more interesting when there's an element like this that holds it all together. If you do an arrangement like this, I would argue that the energy is much more linear and gradual and evolving. Whereas if you don't do an element like this, maybe your track relies more structurally on this concept called A sections and B sections, where the timbre of things changes enough between sections, but maybe there's not that much narrative evolution between the different sections because your main element isn't doing that evolving, growing, crescendoing and decrescendoing thing. In any case, this is the level where you really start thinking about the energy flow of your track. So you really want to be conscious of the idea of building energy, building towards a moment, like for example, this moment here. And even when you're working with audio, don't feel trapped. You can always split a performance like this using Command E and move things around and mix and match however you want. If you made sure during your performance to keep all your movements musical and gradual, then probably it's all going to mesh together pretty well. And that's 3 levels of arrangement. But there was a 4th level. And what was it? Well, all 3 levels so far were subtractive. We've created a bunch of material and now we just need to take away from it. And that's very typical in very dense groove-based music, like in dance music, where you're cramming a lot of elements into a small space. But imagine instead how a composer for a soundtrack for a movie might think. They probably won't think so much subtractive as additive. They'll think of, okay, we have a blank slate, we have a blank canvas, we have an empty space of sound, there's no sound. What element should show up in that space? And then what element should be added to complement that? So instead of taking everything and doing minus, 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 think of having nothing and doing plus, 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 and try to make sure that every element that comes in feels right, like it has its own place. And so that kind of an additive attitude has to kind of start from the very beginning. You kind of want to start with silence or with almost nothing. Again, Command I is your friend to insert silence. Because if we go from silence to this, it's a lot of information, isn't it? So we try to think about the listener from the very first moment until the very last moment. What story are they going to go through? And are we not throwing too much or the wrong information at them? And this is a much more intuitive and artistic way of thinking about arrangement. And it helps, I think, if you've gone through all of that subtractive arrangement stuff before. So you already know kind of how most arrangements end up being structured. But at some point, I think this is the more mature approach, the additive approach, where you say, okay, every sound that comes into this composition, should it be there? Is it motivated? Am I proud of it? Am I happy about it? For example, one thing that I noticed in this moment when I went from silence to here is that there was so much information plus effects happening. And at the beginning, for example, you don't need that. That's not a motivated decision. Let's have silence and peel back everything until there's almost nothing. Fine. And now let's wait until we get bored. See, already this element, it came in quite pushy. It came in as if the listener was already getting bored and we need to add more interest to keep it entertaining. No, let's keep it simple. Let's do less and let's let ourselves get bored and only add elements as and when we think that they're musically motivated. And often you might notice that less is more. If your elements are nicely designed, and that's very much the objective of the triangle method, to have nicely designed elements, then just letting those elements play for a while is enough. You don't need to do more. There we go. Again, we think, when are we getting bored? Notice that the user is already, or the listener is already thinking in terms of sections. Okay, I enjoyed that. I enjoyed the several elements that came in. But why not? Again, we're anticipating the end of the sections. There's something went wrong. And so that's fine. We can keep workshopping this now until we like the track from the very beginning until the very end. But with the additive method, we just make sure that nothing happens that's bad. That sounds so silly. But we have an abundance of musical material that we've generated in the course of the composition of this during the rest of the course. And so we just need to use our taste to really only combine that material in a way that makes sense and that feels mature and that feels like it really works. We want to valorize the material. In French, there's a beautiful phrase called mettre en valeur. I don't think there's a proper English translation of that. It just means to put something in value. Give the material material the time and the space that it deserves so that we can appreciate how nice it is. And you think like a cinematic composer who starts with a blank canvas and is only adding sounds to that canvas as and when the story needs those sounds. With the knowledge that you're probably going to end up with something similar to the subtractive arrangement. It's a very good structure to have, but at the end of the day, the additive approach is the most mature, the most well-rounded one. Those are my 4 levels of arrangement. If you're watching this on YouTube, be sure to like the video and leave me a sweet little comment to say something nice to me. Sign up for the course in the link below. And until next time, stay producing, be good to each other, and take care. Bye-bye.